What does it mean to revisit the Cuban Revolution at this moment? And what does it mean to revisit it with Noam Chomsky?
And in talking to Noam about being in Cuba and so on, we said, well, why don't we do a series of conversations like this about Cuba? And they were not to be out in public initially, just a chat, because we used to talk a lot on a regular basis. So I decided to record them, and we had about, I think, six, over maybe an hour and a half conversations. Some of them went on for 2 hours. So I have, about 12, 13, 14 hours of tape of talking to Noam, and he from memory talking about John Adams, relationship to Cuba and what Kennedy said on this day. And I thought this is interesting. I brought out the typescript and went over it and corrected things and found citations. And then Noam said, look, this is not a good book if we just do it as a conversation. Why don't we actually shape it into a book?
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you enjoy our shows, do consider like, share, and subscribe. You can also consider being a member, but no pressure. Without further ado, let me introduce Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist. He is the author of 40 books, including his most recent book on Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle, co-authored with Noam Chomsky. Vijay, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Nice to see you. I like the way you hesitated before telling people that they have to become members. That was quite a cute hesitation.
It comes with a couple of bucks, so I don't want to pressurize anyone. Okay. I wanted to start with Palestine, given the situation. And I want to pick up on your recent column where you discussed kind of two visions. One led by Washington, where Netanyahu was given a hero's welcome in the Congress, and the other more silently, but the Chinese kind of pushing forward Palestinian unity, and you discuss the 2006 prisoners document. Could you talk a little bit more about these two visions and what they mean for the emerging international relations?
Yeah, firstly, look, we're talking just a few days after the Israelis conducted a major massacre at Al Tabayin school, which is in Gaza City. It's very interesting that since July 4th, the Israelis have conducted 21 school massacres. That's since July 4th of this year, killing over 260 people just in a month, and these are all attacks at schools. On Al Tabayin, the Israelis dropped GBU-30 bombs. Now, this may not mean anything to most people, but a GBU-30 is a 250-pound bomb produced in the United States. Since October, the US government has sold the Israelis over 10 small parcels of weapons. So if you in the United States sell a country over $25 million worth of weapons at a time, then that weapons shipment has to go through congressional scrutiny. That means there's some public debate about it. But if you remain underneath the 25 million threshold, that's an executive decision. No congressional scrutiny, no public debate. So the United States has sold about $1 billion of weapons since October to Israel, but in these small packets, not coming in a big deal which needs congressional scrutiny. It's these bombs that have been used to attack these schools since July 4th. The Al Tabayin was the worst because it killed 100 people at 4:30 in the morning. People were lining up for the Fajr prayer. Now, what's interesting is even the Israelis said that they think that one of the commanders of Islamic Jihad was there. They think, but they're not sure. That's the Israelis saying that. So, making a guess that the commander is there, they killed 100 civilians. They released a list of 19 targets. Look, they killed 100 people. They released a list of 19 targets. You already have a mismatch. Of the 19 people targeted, at least 9 of them have nothing to do with any of these organizations. One of them is an Arabic teacher. One of them is a school principal, deputy mayor of a town. 6 of them are anti-Hamas, of the people on the list. Of the people on the list of 19, 3 of them had been killed before. They were killed. In fact, 2 of them, one killed on August 9th, one killed on August 10th. This bombing was the morning of August 11th. How could you kill people twice? Very unclear what the Israelis are up to. The reason I'm saying all this is the United States' position vis-a-vis this genocidal war is to continue to arm Israel right through. Despite there's some talk here and there about trying to get Israel to moderate, the American or the US vision of this conflict is arm Israel and allow it to commit a genocide. This was in Gaza City. Now they are going to move to attacking schools in Khan Yunis. They've already announced that. That's the United States path. Yeah, you said 2 parts. That's one. The Chinese path has been different. The Chinese do not arm Israel. By the way, if we just look at statistics of arming Israel, 79% of all imports of weapons into Israel come from the United States. 20% comes from Germany. The rest are minuscule. China does not export weapons to Israel. Okay, so that's something people need to understand and appreciate, that between the United States and Germany, 99% of Israel's weapons come from there, nothing from China. Now, the Chinese view from the beginning has been to condemn the war and to call for a 2-state solution, very much like what the Indian government has said, calling for a 2-state solution. Why are they calling for a 2-state solution? People know this is a nonsensical thing. Well, in my opinion, China and India call for a 2-state solution to prevent the annexation of Gaza and the annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is actually to go along the grain of international law. It's important that people don't get caught up in ideas like, well, the 2-state solution is not viable, or that's not relevant. What these countries are not stupid. They know what they're doing. What they're calling for is no annexation of Gaza at the very least. No quote unquote second Nakba and so on. But the Chinese also realize, and this is why this meeting in Beijing was important, the Chinese realize that you can't have a Palestinian political project if the Palestinian factions are not united. This has been a problem for the last 20 years. Over the last 20 years, it has been very difficult to bring Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Fatah, and then a whole series of small groups, some of them based in Syria and so on. Very hard to bring them together to have a discussion about not the future of Palestine, okay? Nobody is that naive. Just a discussion of how they should operate together, not in the armed struggle, because that's out of the question as a dispute, because Fatah is basically, by and large, said we can't follow the armed struggle route. So it's not about the strategies and so on. It's about how they should relate to each other regarding the Palestinian Authority, which is the body set up by Oslo as the governance mechanism for the occupied Palestinian territory. It's a very limited agenda. The limited agenda allowed them to come together in Beijing, the 14 different factions. The Chinese brokered this discussion, very important discussion. It is as important, but of course at a different scale, much smaller scale, than the Chinese brokered meeting between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's a much smaller scale, but it's as important, in my opinion. Having brought them together, what we're seeing very clearly, and I want to be blunt with you, is that the United States is basically taking the path of continue to annihilate the Palestinians, and the Chinese are trying to build peace. It's as clear as that. One is the country of war, the other wants to be the country of peace.
What was fascinating for me was that China does have an extensive trade relationship with Israel as well. I mean, last time I checked, like it has about $15 billion of export, and yet they took this step So it's definitely a refreshing step forward in these gloomy times. I think I want to quickly touch base on Central Africa. And the Tricontinental has come up with a recent dossier on the Democratic Republic of Congo. I encourage everyone to read that. It's a good education on history of the region, particularly Congo, but the Great Lakes region in general. Talks about imperialism and then how during the Cold War era, the US comes in. What I want to ask you, Vijay, is the emerging kind of a Game of Thrones between China on the one hand and the pre-existing multinational corporations, multilateral quote unquote organizations led by the West and the Western governments on one hand. Could you talk a little bit about that? But you can also add as little or as much as you like about imperialism in the region and also the oligarchic rules and the different factions in the region.
Well, first, I'm very grateful to you for saying that about the dossier. The dossier took about 8 years to produce because we worked with political organizations from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, including the Andre Blouin Cultural Center in Kinshasa. Andre Blouin is a very important person. She was a close advisor to Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated now 70 years ago. Andre Blouin was a very important thinker, person who tried to develop a kind of sovereignty politics for both the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic, that part of the world. Yeah. So I'm really happy that you mentioned the dossier itself. We did the dossier because we were concerned. And I particularly feel this is important. I'm concerned about the sudden, liberal worry about the exploitation of Africa. Where does this come from? Yeah, where does this come from? It was perfectly okay for Cecil Rhodes, for instance, to exploit Rhodesia, named after him, South Africa, the Rockefellers and the Oppenheimer family and the mining and so on. Perfectly okay. Perfectly okay for the Europeans and United States to get together in Berlin in 1885 and actually sit with a map and divide up the continent, including making some crazy decisions like about the Gambia River, forming that into a British colony, whereas all around it, Senegal, French colony. Today in the Gambia, they speak, apart from their own languages, English, and around them, people speak French in Senegal, apart from their own languages, Wolof and so on, which is a common language. But still, divided up. Why? Because there's a river that went through what was then to be French West Africa. Okay, so that was fine. It was okay to go and assassinate from Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, 1987. Any African leader that tried to stand up, build the sovereignty of their country, they could be assassinated. All that was okay. That's interesting. And suddenly, out of almost nowhere, 20 years ago, great concern was shown by the United States, Western media, about what was happening in Africa. They started talking about blood diamonds, then blood coltan, blood gold is the most recent in through the Sahel and so on. Where does this sudden worry come from? Very interesting. As soon as the Western multinational corporations started to face a commercial challenge from companies elsewhere, not just from China, from India. Indian firms operating in Ethiopia, in Eastern Africa, including Tanzania and so on. It's not just Chinese firms. The media often just makes it seem that China is the only game in town. Lots of companies coming from other parts of the global south, India, Indonesia, and so on, operating on the African continent. The moment Western companies faced a challenge in the bidding process, completely open bidding process, commercial bidding process, they started to complain about unfair practices, exploitation of labor, and so on. That's the first thing. This is not to say that there's no exploitation of labor or oppression of people and so on. It's just interesting that it took a contest, the, let's say, competitive part of capitalism to come into play for the West suddenly to say, oh my God, it's unfair. When they had a monopoly or near monopoly, everything was fine. It was okay to extract the uranium from the mines in the DRC, or they extract the uranium from the mines in Niger and take it all to France. That was fine. But the moment somebody else came and said, hey, I want to also bid for the uranium, then unfair practices. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is that an strange kind of environmentalism comes in, where good thinking, sensitive people say that, well, you shouldn't extract the minerals from your country. It's a critique around the term extractivism. It's really bad to extract the minerals. Keep them in the ground. In other words, what you're telling the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of minerals, $2.5 trillion is the minimum value of the minerals under the ground, but it has one of the poorest populations in the world. What you're telling people in the DRC is you should just live in poverty. It's okay. When we could extract the minerals, it was fine. Extractivism was okay. But now that the Chinese and others are coming in, Indians, and building factories and so on, we think it's a bad idea. We think you should keep it in the ground. So the second very interesting point is that this environmental concern suddenly appears to tell people they shouldn't control their own sovereign land. Now, it's interesting. Nobody's saying that you should drill and dig and destroy your country. But there are ways of mining things without being entirely devastating. It's not an either or. At the same time, the real question isn't about the environment. The real question is who gets to control the benefits of the mining? Should it be a Canadian mining company or an Australian mining company that extracts the raw materials and takes it out of the country? Or should it be the people themselves? This is the same debate that is held all over the world. In India, for instance, is it the case that in Orissa, the Adivasi people or the indigenous people of the area are saying, look, don't take the stuff out of the ground? What most of them are saying is, we are getting no benefit from this. We're not getting schools, we're not getting anything. You get a company coming from elsewhere, extracting the materials and taking it away. What about us? We want control, we want ownership, we want sovereignty. So the central theme in our work is this debate around sovereignty. These countries want sovereignty. Interesting, the Chinese showed up in these countries and said, okay, we're going to work with you. We're going to help you industrialize your country. We don't want to just take the raw materials and take it to China. That creates problems for us. We would prefer that you process it in the DRC and you make an industrial capacity increase. In fact, in China, the last 2 years, there's been a big debate about how to have industrialization in Africa. At the China-Africa Summit, this has been a major theme in the last 2 summits, industrialization of Africa. This is a question which hasn't been posed in the continent for at least 50 or 60 years. People have not posed the question, industrialization. Zambia. Should Zambia allow the copper to just be removed, driven across the border into Uganda in trucks? Borders which I've visited where there's absolutely no octroi, the trucks just go past because somebody is being bribed or nobody cares? Or should you have control over your copper, process it, make copper wires, make high quality copper goods, and then export those goods? You have value added, you're able to control the revenue. You don't are not a victim of transfer payments and so on. So that's the agenda we wanted to put on the table, that, look, it's not about, like a kind of radical environmentalism, because that's racist. That's telling people you should never have electricity in your houses. You should just live in a museum so that we can come and visit you. That's a racist attitude. And also this idea that China is the problem. It's a ludicrous idea because, what the Chinese are doing is something different. Also, they are not behaving grotesquely different from Western or Australian mining companies. It's not qualitatively worse. It's about the same. Business people are business people. Okay, there's a ruthlessness amongst them. In the core, they are ruthless. So yes, there's a contest happening. Unfortunately, the United States seems largely to be losing the contest overall. Here and there are little victories like the Lopito corridor with Angola. But, by and large, they lose. Why? Why are they losing this? Because the Chinese have an enormous surplus. They can walk into a community and say, hey, we're going to build a hospital, we're going to build a high-speed rail, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. United States can't. The US cannot come in and even put in enough money to match a Chinese bid, let alone the secondary aspects of the bid, the hospital, this. And I was surprised to talk to an executive who told me that when the Chinese come in and they build hospitals and so on, that's corruption. I said, how is it corruption to build a public hospital? Like, what's corrupt? He said they're bribing the country to get the deal. Yes, yes, exactly. They're bribing the country, but they're not bribing individuals. They're bribing the whole society. They are saying, give us the deal and you get a hospital, a school, high speed rail. I would take that bribe any day, any day.
This narrative of cheap labor also reminded me of, I mean, there are not a lot of work on this, but I have noticed that how when Japan and Germany or even France, they were industrializing after the Second World War, the narrative in the US was our companies are trying to rebuild them because they are our allies now. When China emerged as the industrial power, it's cheap labor again. Now you have to shed tears for labor and everything. I want to move to Cuba now. I'm jumping from continent to continent, perhaps, reflective of the tricontinental. What does it mean to revisit the Cuban Revolution at this moment? And what does it mean to revisit it with Noam Chomsky?
Well, the book came out of an interesting experience. Chomsky and I have been friends for many decades, and we did a book before, which I've talked to you about, The Withdrawal, which was about, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and so on, U.S. wars overseas, the fragility of the United States at this point, and so on. So when the book came out in Spanish from Captain Swing, I took a copy of it to Cuba and visited the Cuban singer Silvio Rodriguez. Now, I don't know if you know Silvio's work, but Silvio is like the Bob Dylan of Latin America. I mean, I saw him play at the Zocalo in Mexico City, which is the big square. It was packed out, people singing along to his songs. He's an enormous star, beautiful music, ballads and so on. Anyway, he has a studio in Havana called Ojalá, which is also the name of one of his songs. And I went and gave him a copy of the book because he's a huge Noam Chomsky fan. He was so excited to get the book, and then he gave me a copy of a book he had done, which is on Cuban music. The kind of radical edge of Cuban music, big giant picture book. So of course I went and I took that and gave it to Noam. And in talking to Noam about being in Cuba and so on, we said, well, why don't we do a series of conversations like this about Cuba? And they were not to be out in public initially, just a chat, because we used to talk a lot on a regular basis. So I decided to record them, and we had about, I think, 6, over maybe an hour and a half conversations. Some of them went on for 2 hours. So I have, about 12, 13, 14 hours of tape of talking to Noam, and he from memory talking about John Adams, relationship to Cuba and what Kennedy said on this day. And, I thought this is interesting. I, brought out the typescript and went over it and corrected things and found citations. And then Noam said, look, this is not a good book if we just do it as a conversation. Why don't we actually shape it into a book? And he said, you go ahead and do it. Thanks, Noam. And I'll review it afterwards. So I went and I took the conversation and I made a book, sent it to him. He was going through it, made some corrections and so on. Then he had a stroke. That was very, very difficult, that stroke he had. He's 95 years old, recovering from a stroke. He's like a fighter. So, the publisher decided, well, we'll do some more edits and the book is out. The book basically is produced out of frustration that both he and I have had with US policy in the last 10 years regarding Cuba. When Trump put Cuba back on the a state sponsor of terrorism list, Noam and I released a statement arguing that, in fact, Cuba is a state sponsor of health, not state sponsor of terrorism. They've been sending doctors all around the world. This is a ridiculous, ludicrous thing. Biden didn't remove Cuba from the list. And so this has been a kind of thorn. He and I had published a lot of things together on this. And I go to Cuba regularly, and I used to call him and tell him, this is what I saw, this is what I did, and so on. He took a great deal of interest in that. And the book basically is an argument against this thorn that is in the side, which says, what are you doing? It's a country of 11 million people. It's smaller than New York City. What's your problem? You're a country 370 million. Why are you bullying this country of 11 million? For God's sake. That's the book. It's basically, the subtitle would be, for God's sake. Yeah. Why are you doing this?
I want to quickly discuss Venezuela. We recently hosted Zoe Alexandra, and we dedicated a full show on Venezuela. So we don't want to go over every detail. I just want to ask, and this was one of the questions put forth by one of our members. Could you talk a little bit about the Bolivarian Republic's vision on one hand, and what does Chavez initially, but Maduro now represent, and what do people like Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez or Guaido, what do they represent? These two visions.
Yeah, I mean, I first went to Venezuela in 1995. This is before Chavez became the president. I remember well the country. It was a very affluent country, fed by oil. But also unequal and dependent. And, even though it was such a rich country filled with oil, while I was there eating dinner one night, there was a television playing in the restaurant. And Carlos Andres Perez, the then president, Social Democrat, he was elected on the basis we are not going back to the International Monetary Fund. And there was Carlos Andres Perez on television saying, we're going to go back to the International Monetary Fund, conduct austerity. And this led in a way to Chavez. I mean, Chavez then picks this up, and says, look, after the rebellion called the Caracazo of 1989, after Andres Perez's betrayal, we need something different. It's interesting. This time I was there during the elections, spent 2 weeks in Venezuela, went to, saw the opposition elections, rallies, saw the opposition in their rallies and the rallies of the Chavistas. Very interesting thing. I'm going to be very blunt with you. At the opposition rallies, where Maria Corina Machado, Edmund Gonzalez, and so on stage, that rally was whiter, was taller, and better fed. Okay? I mean, it is actually a physical thing that you can notice. Whiter, taller, better fed. Lots of bratty looking kids, with new sneakers on and so on. At the Chavista rallies, they are shorter, darker, more Indio, what in Venezuela called Zambo, and more black, more Afro-Venezuelan. And they are also more underfed. But they are vigorous Chavistas. I've seen them on the street from 1998 till just about 2.5 weeks ago. It's the same kind of crowd. It's the same base. Once Chavez came, and Chavez himself was a person of indigenous black heritage. When Chavez came out there and said, I am your destiny, we are going, I mean, Chavez spoke like that. Yeah. I am going to carry the sword of Bolivar into the future. He created a political force. This constituency was not available for anybody. He made Chavismo. He made this political force. This political force wants a socialist Venezuela. They want to use the oil wealth, have sovereignty over it, and use it to build their country for their benefit. That's what is their vision. This is the vision of Chavez, and it's there on the street. In fact, the crowds were chanting the day after the election, "No volverán." We will not return. We will not return to what? To that, to the oligarchy, to the lighter, taller, better fed looking people who have run Venezuela since, since Bolivar first showed up in 1821 independence. I mean, these people have had their day. We will not go back. No volverán. That was the slogan. This is very clear. Maria Corina Machado wants to privatize the oil, not to keep it for the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. When Chavez expropriated land and property, he expropriated the land and property of people like a family. She wants to return the expropriated land and property to people like a family, including a family. And she wants to close down all the benefits given to the working class in Venezuela. Now, this is not to say that the Bolivarian revolution is the thing of perfection. It's filled with knots and problems, frustrations, errors, and so on. But they are fighting a war against the sanctions regime imposed by the United States, a sabotage regime, an attempt to overthrow them politically, and so on. I mean, the US government just told Mr. Maduro, we'll give you amnesty. I mean, how can you talk like that to a person who, even if you don't agree with the election results of this election, he's still the president till January. You can't talk to him like that, give you amnesty. Who are you to give amnesty? So there are two distinct visions in Venezuela. It's just that, making any kind of advance, any kind of socialist type process, you're going to have reversals, you're going to have errors and mistakes and so on. It's impossible to have something go in a straight line. I mean, I grew up in West Bengal. I was born in Bengal 10 years before the Left Front took power in 1977. The Left Front governed Bengal for 34 years and then was wiped out in an election in 2011. I know what it feels like when the public turns against you. The public has not turned against the Bolivarians. They still mobilize large numbers of people on the street. It's interesting. Why did the public turn against the left in Bengal? One of the reasons was because of the left's success. I mean, the left provided land reform, created a set of middle farmers, and then the middle farmers said, we don't need the left. We want somebody to protect our private property. Because Indian constitution doesn't allow you to do land reform and then collectivize agriculture. So you'll always have an individualistic consciousness and you'll never be able to create a collective consciousness. The very success of the left, and this is the zigzags and reversals, the very success that it had was its undoing. Because it did land reform, it created a middle peasantry that turned against the left and said, now we want something different.
This was elsewhere.
Pardon?
This was elsewhere too, not just Bengal. Like one can think about China, Russia, yes.
Absolutely. I mean, unless you have some process of creating collective consciousness, through mass mobilization. I mean, look, we know the errors and excesses of the Cultural Revolution, but one of the aims of the Cultural Revolution was to try to ensure that individual consciousness was not going to grow at the expense of collective consciousness. It was very poorly handled. It was super oppressive for a lot of people, but that was the in a way the attempt. To prevent the development of individual consciousness. In Venezuela, interesting, whatever happens, they mobilize onto the streets. And this collectivity of the Chavista remains intact, despite, again, all the, reversals, falls, problems, and so on. I mean, people come at me and say, well, what about this? What about that? Yes, all of it may be true. I don't want to contest. I don't want to go down an Excel sheet of all the errors and problems, and have a column that says explanation why. Let's just assume that there are all these problems. Still, the base is loyal. And I talked to a opposition advisor, very senior person who I've known for a very long time. And he told me quite clearly, he said, look, He said, I think this election had fraud, but he said, I don't think it mattered. I think the percentages, 52 for the government, 44 for the opposition, that's about realistic. He said, how are you going to get 51% of the population to agree to reverse the gains made by the mass of the people through the expropriation? How are you going to make he was very clear. You are not going to get 51% of the population agreeing to privatization of oil. He said the reason the opposition gets 44% is that many people don't like what the privations that have happened due to sanctions. And they have been convinced that the privations are because of corruption, not sanctions. This is a narrative issue that what's really being fought about, nobody denies the privations, is that the government argues the privations are because of sanctions, and the opposition argues the privations are because of corruption. It's a narrative difference. But more people agree it's about the sanctions and corruption, which is why the government prevails.
I want to come a little bit closer home to Bangladesh, and there are a couple of issues. I want your response, particularly on this narrative from sections of the left, and I'm using sections of the left because not all sections of the left. A lot of the left still thinks it's largely a student-led mass kind of protest movement that dislodged a very unpopular kind of government that was increasingly becoming authoritarian. But a smaller, I think, section of the left is not just raising concerns about the Cold War in South Asia, particularly in Pakistan, but one can also include Sri Lanka and Nepal recently. They're characterizing this as color revolution. I want to hear your thoughts on what's going on in Bangladesh.
Well, firstly, many things can be happening at the same time. I think that's important. I don't think this is a choice between people's revolution, color revolution. I think this becomes too simplistic. It's a very complicated, fast-moving scenarios in all these countries. Firstly, it's true that in Sri Lanka, whatever the character of the protest movement a few years ago, it is true that the beneficiary of this was the United States. United States essentially plucked Ranil Wickremesinghe, who had one seat in the Sri Lankan parliament, one seat himself. His party had one seat, and he was ascended to prime minister. He takes over the reins of the country with one seat. How does he do that? US Embassy intervenes. There was a protest, whatever the character of the protest. Some people say, well, it was all fake. Whatever it was, it doesn't matter. The beneficiary in Sri Lanka was the United States because they put, in a sense, the sections of the Sri Lankan political establishment that wanted to have more trade with China on the back foot. Now, this is not going to last forever. It's likely at the next election, the JVP is going to be the biggest party. If the JVP is the biggest party, that is going to move the needle of Sri Lanka toward the left. We'll see what happens. These things aren't permanent. They go in various forms of cycles and so on. Pakistan was second. In Pakistan, certainly there was a lot of exasperation in the United States over Imran Khan's dealing with the Russians, not the Chinese. The Chinese situation goes back a very long time, but certainly with the Russians, Imran Khan was taking a strong position that you shouldn't condemn Russia. In fact, he was there on the day that Russian troops entered Ukraine. Now, was he removed in a coup? It doesn't matter. He was removed. The beneficiary of the removal of Imran Khan was the United States, because when the so-called alliance comes in, the two old parties, the Bhuttos and Nawaz Sharif's family, the Sharif family, these are two big families. When they came in together, they basically welcomed the US generals back in town. So the beneficiary was definitely the United States, regardless of how this happened, regardless of the situation. In Nepal, it's interesting. Prachanda, his government wasn't anti-US. It was more worried about the role of India was playing in Nepal. But at the same time, United States worked a deal called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where they got the Nepali parliament, majority communist parliament, to vote for a deal where Nepal puts in a lot of money into building an electrical power line to India. Okay, enormous amount of money. Nepal puts in US investment minimal in this, in the hundreds of millions. It's nothing for what they're getting. And this is in the Prachanda period. Both the Maoist Center and the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Socialists, voted for the MCC in their own parliament. This is a problem. But through parliamentary machinations, KP Oli, who was the head of the Unified Marxist-Leninist, which is the more right wing of the communist parties, more right side of the parties, made a deal throughout the Maoist Center from the prime ministership. Oli is now the prime minister. Oli is certainly more willing to listen to the United States. Other people go further than me, but let's just stay there, than Prachanda was. So now in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, you have relatively more pro-US governments than you had before. Well, Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina has been there since 2009, was certainly making some interesting moves regarding China and even Russia and India and so on. Always had a close tie with India. She was very unpopular with a large section of students for a long time over this quota issue. This goes back, to 2013, in fact, to 2008. The quota issue was raised as a political issue before Sheikh Hasina came to power. But during her time in power, there were two contradictory things happening. There was the arrival of a mass sentiment saying no quotas any longer. Only 10% of the quotas are for the children, descendants of the freedom struggle. The rest are for women, the disabled, people from marginal parts of Bangladesh and so on. There are quotas up to 50%, but only 10% was for beneficiaries through the freedom struggle. What Sheikh Hasina said is those who were against this quota were Razakars, meaning they were the people who had committed the genocide in 71. And you will know that in 2013, there was a massive demonstration at Shahbag in Dhaka, where people came out to demonstrate against the Razakars, saying that they need to be prosecuted. Their leader, one fellow who killed 342 civilians, needs to be killed, not sent to life imprisonment. He was eventually killed. In Shahbag, the quota thing was raised in an opposite direction. It was, should it be defended against these people? So this political turmoil has been there for a long time. Sheikh Hasina's problem is that she could not tolerate dissent and was shutting down dissent everywhere, going after photojournalists, going after writers, closing down media houses. And when the students protested in 2018, when there was a bus that rammed and killed two students on safety, her response was again repression. And I think it's really this cycle of repression that was her undoing. She just lost popularity, even though she may not have lost the debate. I think that's important for, to put on the table, that the question of who is going to come after her was not so settled. This was not an uprising of Islamist students against a secular government. This was a very complicated uprising. Most of the people who became part of the student movement were not necessarily from the Jamaat student organizations. They would have been from the BNP student organizations, the Bangladesh National Party. There were even people on the streets from the Awami League student organization, because otherwise they would just lose their credibility. But it is true that 2 days after Sheikh Hasina gets on a flight and goes to Ghaziabad in India, there was a meeting at the US Embassy where various forces were invited to come and have a conversation about what happens next. It is also true that the students, trying to protect themselves from the military, hastily put forward Muhammad Yunus's name. It's also, in other words, they didn't think about what his politics are. They were trying to protect this process from military takeover. That was a tactical thing that they did. But it's also true that the cabinet that's there now is pretty appalling. I mean, there's lots of names from the past there. They put a couple of student leaders up, but I must say, it's not an impressive list of people in the cabinet. So all kinds of things can be true. It's not like the US government in a country the size of Bangladesh, right? Something, what is it, 160 million people, 180 million, something. It's a very large country. It's not, a country of 10 million as Chile was in 73, 10, 12 million. It's a very large country. It's very hard to do a coup of a classical sort in a country like this, where so many interests are at play. The United States doesn't have a free run. On the other hand, it is true that they are going to benefit from this, that it is likely that the government that comes into Dhaka is going to be decidedly more pro-US. It's going to be decidedly more anti-Indian. And I think this is creating a lot of concern in India, that the United States is meddling in what India considers its neighborhood, putting in and more anti-India governments in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and trying to encircle India. This is the reason why the former diplomat M.K. Bhadrakumar put out a tweet saying, "I'm warning you, this is happening." I don't want to exaggerate that. I mean, I think, again, many things can happen. You can have authentic movements, but the beneficiary is a certain person, not you, who sacrificed in the movement. Remember, the students very early started to say that those who sacrifice should be sitting in government house, not the military or the Bangladesh National Party. But, you can say whatever you want. This is a power struggle. This is not a legal issue. You can't go to the courts and sue somebody and say, listen, I was the principal person who worked on the overthrow of Sheikh Hasina. I want to have a court case against this person. He sat at home the whole time and now he's the Minister of the Interior. You can't, it doesn't work like that. This is a power struggle, not a moral or legal struggle. And in many of these cases, whether the demonstrations were authentic or not, they really lost the power struggle to those who are much more powerful and better at maneuvering in taking reins of the situation. So as I say, I think this debate is, in fact, it's a debate that needs to go to a different level. That you need to bring these two together and in a Hegelian way, transcend the duality between people's revolution and color revolution and see it for what it is, which is a kind of combination of all kinds of things.
I asked this question primarily for two reasons. I mean, in some cases, I feel that the evidence of a color revolution becomes much more clear. Like when one thinks about the Maidan coup, for instance, the evidence is much more overwhelming and much more clear. And those who organize it were very, very clearly right-wing, that it becomes easier to take a position. Then there are cases where the change of regime or government doesn't come through popular protest. Sometimes the legal mechanisms are used, a court case, a corruption charge, sometimes with the blessing of military in the case of Pakistan. But then there are these cases like the case of Sri Lanka and more recently in Bangladesh, where a popular protest is involved. And when that happens, I do often try to listen to people on the ground, including the left on the ground. And when I try to listen to people in Bangladesh, including the left, they are concerned about the future role of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, but more importantly, the role of Jamaat. They are concerned about minority rights. They are concerned about neoliberal policies. They are concerned about the role of India, but they don't talk a lot about as if this is a color revolution, which a lot of leftists in the international space are talking about. And so that was why I asked this question to you. And I don't think you are doing that, but sections of the left, which I don't want to mention here, I think are just saying that this is color revolution. I think okay, we are coming to an end. I think my last question would be if you could talk a little bit about New Caledonia, what has happened there recently. You have mentioned the military alliance in the Pacific. If you could tell us a little bit about that, but also the role of France, nuclear testings, and the popular nationalist movement for self-determination, where they are as we stand in 2024.
Well, in October, I'm going to be in New Zealand for a meeting of forces from the South Pacific that are coming to discuss some of these issues, including to argue for a new or a renewal of the nuclear-free South Pacific zone. It's the Treaty of Rarotonga, which had been signed, 40 years ago, but is being violated consistently. Violated how? Well, firstly, as you say, on the so-called French possessions, they tested nuclear weapons. So did the United States, Bikini Atoll and so on. They tested nuclear weapons. They tested all kinds of dangerous weapons, not just nuclear. Well, how is it being violated now? The United States planning to bring nuclear weapons into an airbase near Darwin in Australia. This would violate the treaty. They've extended the runway to bring bigger aircraft which carries nuclear payload. And keep it there in a way to threaten China. This is a violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga. It's important. Many of these island nations in the South Pacific are used as military bases by Western countries. So-called New Caledonia is a territory large of the French. And you've seen not only in South Pacific but in the Sahel region in Africa real unrest against French interference in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. There have been military coups, basically anti-French military coups. In New Caledonia and the Solomon Islands, there's been a big upsurge saying we don't want Western domination of our future. We want to be able to exercise our sovereignty. They also want to trade openly and freely with China. They don't want somebody to tell them you can't do that. This was the case in the Solomon Islands, where there was almost a coup against the government there. Very serious situation there. In New Caledonia, there's been a protest movement. This is part of a movement that's been going on for over 50 years. The Kanak people are fighting for their dignity, for their civil rights, and so on. This is a very long and important struggle that they've been waging. But it's related to some of these bigger issues now, because if they get ability to exercise more sovereignty, what is it going to mean for France? What does it mean for France? Means what's it going to mean for the NATO entry into the seas around China? What is this going to mean then for the new Cold War against China and so on? So the implications on a small island of people fighting for their civil liberties is related suddenly to a very large conversation about the potential of war between the West and China. No joke, really. I mean, because these are the so-called second island chain, that divides China. This is how the West sees it. This is where the war is going to come from. It's going to come from Okinawa Island. Again, indigenous Okinawan population, very distressed about being caught in the middle of somebody else's war. You're going to see this in the Philippines. Again, populations there distressed about being caught in somebody else's war. Whether it's New Caledonia or it's the Bikini Atoll, Samoa, etc. All these countries distressed about being put in the firing line. I mean, this is not their war, man. Australia's largest trading partner is China. New Zealand's largest trading partner is China. Taiwan's largest trading partner is China. It is ridiculous that this new Cold War is going on. For what reason? Because the United States can't produce as good technical equipment as the Chinese. I mean, instead of spending so much money trying to destroy the Chinese, why not spend money on research and development and produce the next generation of green technology in the US? Then maybe you'll have some potential of economic sovereignty yourself, rather than be an indebted country that uses war to control the rest of the world. I mean, put that money, make a breakthrough, train your own students, don't teach them to hate science, things like that. They are not doing it. I was in China recently, as you are, and in the United States, the fastest high-speed rail goes at 150 kilometers an hour. Beijing Shanghai train already twice that, 300 kilometers an hour. I had a briefing from somebody who told me about the new Chinese train, 600 kilometers an hour. It's a hovercraft. It rises above the tracks on magnets. It takes turns at a very strange angle. 600, it's like flying in a plane. This is what the Chinese are doing. They are building trains that can go at 600 kilometers an hour. They are not building 500-pound bombs that can wipe out 500 Palestinians at one go. I mean, that's the choice for humanity. Returning to our first point, the choice is between war and peace. People have to pick.
We'll leave it there, Vijay. As always, you were so generous with your time, and thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.